We now move on to our next speaker, one of our own members of CIB's Executive Committee, National Executive Committee, and a member of Labour Safeguards campaign, and from that he represents that organisation on the National Executive Committee. His name is well known to everybody, John Mills, a supporter of the Labour Party and campaigning inside the Labour Party in this country to get onto a realistic position concerning the European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome John Mills.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I must say, I would like to start by saying how nice it is to be here with many people whom I've worked with over a long period of time on these issues. I indeed have got form. I was, believe it or not, the national agent for the No campaign in 1975. And I've been the secretary of the Labour Euro Safeguards campaign, which is the main left-of-centre pressure group to do with the EU, ever since then. So I've had a long period of time to watch the scenery changing behind me. You may recall that in 1975, when there was the referendum, it was the Labour Party that split roughly 50-50 in favour of staying in or coming out. It was the Conservative Party in those days which was very strongly in favour of staying in, roughly 80-20, which produced the two-thirds result. Now, of course, the situation is very different. The Labour Party is, on the whole, pretty Europhile, and the Conservatives much less so. And we'll have to see what happens over the coming years, which is what I would like to talk about, and see what the direction things are likely to move in. I think it's worth starting off, though, by just saying a bit about where we are right now. One of the polls in the film that you saw earlier on suggested that if there was a referendum tomorrow, we would lead by a large majority. I have to say that I'm not nearly so sanguine that that would be the result. I have here the polls that were taken month by month over the period leading up to the referendum in 1975. And you may recall that even just a few months before that referendum, there was a big majority for coming out, which just, or not a big majority, but at least a majority, which just melted away as a result of the onslaught there was on the pro side. And although I think the situation will be more even next time we have a referendum on this issue in this country than it was then, keeping with the status quo and so forth is a very, very powerful driver in these sort of referendums, and I don't think the result would be nearly so easy to predict as you might think. Although I do think that over the coming period the situation may change, and that's what I'd really like to talk to you about this afternoon. Now, if you ask me what the UK electorate would like, I think the reality is, whether you like it or not, that most people in the UK would like to stay in the EU provided there were substantial changes made to our relationship with the other member states. That's what the polls show very strongly. So the real issue is what's going to happen over the next few years. Are there going to be those changes made? And if not, what will the outcome be if there's a referendum when it's clear that these changes aren't going to happen? And these seem to be the really important drivers as to what's going to occur over the coming period. Now, timing isn't everything in politics, but it counts for a lot. And let me just lay out for you a scenario for the next few years to see whether I convince you that this is probably what the sort of way events might develop. First of all, we've got two major elections or referendums coming up over the next few months. We've got the Euro elections coming up very shortly in May, and we've got the Scottish referendum coming up in September. Now, these are going to set the scene for what happens in 2015 when there's the general election. My guess in 2015 is that the chances of having a Labour government on its own are actually quite high. And this is mainly because the negotiations between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives over changing the arrangements of the House of Lords broke down. And in response to this, the Lib Dems refused to support boundary reorganisation. And as a result, the Labour Party's only got to win about 34% of the plurality, whereas to become a government on its own without having a coalition, the Conservatives need about 41% of the vote. Bearing in mind there's likely to be a substantial split on the right of centre between Conservatives and UKIP, this does provide at least a reasonable chance that the Labour Party will come in with a majority government in 2015. I don't think there's as much as a 50% chance of this. I think it's more likely that we're going to finish up with either that or a Lib-Lab result. But one thing that does seem to be fairly unlikely, bearing in mind the electoral arithmetic I've just given you, is that there'll be an out-and-out victory for the Conservatives, and if that doesn't happen, then there won't be a referendum in 2017. But if there is either a coalition between the Lib Dems and the Labour Party or an outright Labour government, I think the situation over the next 5 years, between 2015 and 2020, could look very problematical for that government. I think, particularly in the Labour Party, there isn't actually now a huge amount of discussion about what the EU is going to do to a Labour government if it's elected, and the Lib Dems, or at least the leadership, are so much in favour of the EU that I don't think they've given a huge amount of thought either to the problems they're going to confront. But let me just give you a list of the difficulties which I think they're going to face. The first is that we heard about the evil effects of the single currency on the EU, and they're bad enough as it is with the very high levels of unemployment there are and the very low levels of economic growth. But I'm far from sure that the situation isn't going to get worse before it gets better. And the main reason for this is that the Eurozone's comparative quiescence at the moment is very largely dependent on enormous amounts of bank loans that are mounting up and mounting up. Now, debt in itself is not such a bad thing, as long as you've got the capacity to service the interest charges and to repay it. But what is really pernicious about debt is when it builds up and actually you've got an economy which isn't growing at all, and the ratio between the amount of debt you've got and your capacity to pay it back and service it reduces all the time. And that's the situation that the Eurozone is in. So I think that between now and 2020, there is at least a fair chance that what's going to happen is that the Eurozone is going to run into very serious difficulties. I think there are a number of ways this might happen. You might get governments elected in countries like Greece, which simply aren't prepared to implement austerity anymore. You might get the Germans throwing over the traces and saying they're not going to subsidise everybody else anymore. Or you might get the markets turning against the euro. But one way or another, I think the chance of none of these things happening between now and 2020 aren't that high. So that's one major problem area for whatever government's in power then. Even if the euro does survive, there are also going to be big problems that are going to have to be overcome in terms of the governance of Europe and how to respond to the lack of banking integrity in Europe. And this is going to involve either more mutualisation of debt, and it's also going to involve more integration of policy making on budgeting and so forth. And this is going to make the countries that are in the euro more powerful in relation to those that are outside. And one of the really major difficulties that any government is going to have to face in this country is how to avoid a situation where it all becomes two-tier, with one very powerful group in the centre calling the shots, who are ring the single currency, and another group outside. And bear in mind that all the countries that are currently outside, 18 countries are in the euro at the moment, and whatever it is, 10 outside. But all those countries that are outside are obligated, or nearly all of them, to join the euro. So we may find that the 18 goes up to 20 or 23 or 24 or something, and we're more and more isolated. So there's a big problem there. There's the rising cost of the European Union. The European Union is incredibly expensive for us. It's actually quite hard to find the total costs in the of Office for National Statistics which are produced, because they're spread around, but the totals are there if you look hard enough. And in 2013, it was over £12 billion net, and it's rising all the time. The Office for Budget Responsibility thinks that the total costs of the EU are going to rise by another £10 billion over the next 3 or 4 years. So there's a very substantial cost element that's going to have to be negotiated by the next government at the time when the balance of payments in this country is going down the pan anyway. I hardly need to dwell on the problems about immigration. I think one of the better things that the European Union did, to be honest with you, to start off with, was to allow the free movement of people, which worked well when we were dealing with a comparatively small number of countries with roughly the same standards of living. But it clearly works very much worse when you've got an enormous economic gradient between countries like Bulgaria and the UK, with a difference of nearly 75% between the income levels. And at the moment, we're in a situation where we're restricting the number of people coming in from outside the EU, many of whom actually have a lot of advantages if they come to this country, like students and skilled workers, whereas we can't do anything at all about the immigration, or very little anyway, from the rest of the EU. There's all the issues around accountability and the capacity of MEPs to hold the confidence of their electorates, the way the Commission operates, the lack of democracy and so forth. And the problem about all these things adding up together is that they do present a fair chance of a rise in underlying Euroscepticism in the UK, which is going to be really very difficult for that government in charge to do something about. And I think actually as a result of the most recent speech that was made by Ed Miliband in March this year, the Labour Party may have painted itself into something of a corner here, because there was a very important change made in that speech, which was prior to that, the position of the Labour Party was, and this is true of the Lib Dems and the Conservatives, there was what's called a referendum lock. And this meant that if there were any further significant transfers of power to the EU, there was going to be a referendum, but the referendum wasn't going to be an in-and-out referendum. It was going to be on whether or not whatever transfer of powers were contemplated were going to be accepted or not. Now, in the speech that Ed Miliband made in March, this was changed. And what he said there was that if there were transfers of powers in the form of a treaty change, there wouldn't be a referendum on the treaty change, there would be an in-out referendum. And this could be a very important change that's been made. I'm sure the calculation that was made by the Labour Party was that it was very unlikely that treaty changes would occur over that period. And you can see why the leadership of the European Union, the Commission and so on, don't want to have treaty changes, because this might trigger off referendums elsewhere, which they might lose. But with all the instability there is around the European Union at the moment, it's not at all clear to me that there won't, it's a racing certainty that there won't be treaty changes sometime between now and 2020. And with the change of rules and legislation that the Labour Party's promised, that would trigger a referendum. And if it triggered a referendum at a time when the Labour Party wasn't very popular, which tends to be the case with any government which is in power for a fair period of time, you've seen this with the Conservative governments at the moment, and if it was campaigning against a more and more Eurosceptic electorate, it seems to me that in those circumstances, there is really quite a substantial chance that there would be a referendum, and that the result in those circumstances would be that there would be a British exit and we would leave. Now, the other possibility then is that you would then get even if there isn't a referendum running through to the period up to 2020, that the Conservatives get back in power in 2020. And my guess is that over the next 5 years, the Conservative Party will become more Eurosceptic and more likely, therefore, to give a commitment and get elected that there will be a referendum. So one way or another, it does seem to me that the way that events are likely to turn out over the next 5 or 10 years is going to make it, first of all, more likely that a referendum will take place. And bear in mind that there won't ever be a referendum unless there's a majority for one in the House of Commons. And that secondly, if in those circumstances which I've just described, a referendum does take place, that that referendum is more likely than to be won, a lot more likely than if one was taken tomorrow. So, you know, it is a long haul. I've been on the Eurosceptic camp since 1975. As I said at the beginning, I've seen the situation change and change again. But I think that it's very important not to give up hope, not to come to the view that, you know, we've all been battling on for 40 years and we're still there. Timing, as I said at the beginning, is very important, and I think it may well be that the situation will shift in our favour, whatever happens at the next general election, for the reason which I've given you. Now, I'd like to finish up with a story. And the story, I think, somewhat really encapsulates what the difference is between the establishment in this country and the people who take the sort of views which you, I'm sure, share in this room. And you can decide which side you're on when I tell you this story. It's a true story, apparently, about what happened in the North Atlantic. And it's a transcript of an actual radio conversation between a US naval ship and Canadian authorities off the coast of Newfoundland in October 1995. It was released by the Chief of Naval Operations very shortly afterwards. And this is how it went. Americans, please divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision. Canadians, recommend you divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid a collision. Americans, this is the captain of a US Navy ship. I say again, divert your course. Canadians, no, I say again, you divert your course. Americans, this is, I'm no good at American accents. This is the aircraft carrier USS Lincoln, the second largest ship in the United States Atlantic Fleet. We are accompanied by 3 destroyers, 3 cruisers, and numerous support vessels. I demand that you change your course 15 degrees north, that is 15 degrees north, or countermeasures will be undertaken to ensure the safety of this ship. Canadians, this is a lighthouse, your call.